Hi, and welcome back to me reading another one of my stories. This is chapter 3 of How Not to Date a Gryffindor, which is a Tom Harry story with a mature rating. You can find the first 2 chapters in their own playlist. All my chaptered stories will have their own playlist, so you can very easily find them in the future. Let's get started. Tom's 16th birthday came and went with very little fanfare, which is exactly how Tom liked it. They had tea and a birthday cake in Remus's quarters, where Tom also lived during holidays, and Tom opened all the presents people had gotten him. His Slytherin classmates had gotten him things like a new Slytherin scarf or a book on the history of the Wizengamot, which Tom genuinely looked forward to reading. Remus had gotten him some practical items like new underwear, socks, and shoes, as well as a book on the use of transfiguration in defense against the dark arts, which Tom also couldn't wait to read. Severus had gotten him a few more obscure potions ingredients, which Tom looked forward to using in some advanced potions. All in all, it was a good birthday, and Tom happily told his guardian so as he polished off a second slice of cake. This has been a very good 16th birthday. And just think, next year I'll be 17 and an adult at last. Remus and Severus exchanged a very amused glance. Well, you'll be able to use magic outside of Hogwarts at any rate, Remus said delicately before sipping his tea. 2 days after Tom's birthday and the day before the students would return from their Yule holidays, Severus called Tom in his office. Have a seat, Severus said, sitting behind his desk. Tom slowly, carefully sat down and gave Severus a questioning look. And when Severus produced a tea set and poured them both cups of steaming tea, Tom got downright suspicious. Sharing tea in his office was very much a Remus thing. Severus's thing was brewing and insults. What's going on? Tom asked, eyeing the cup of tea Severus placed in front of him as though it might explode at any moment. I wished to have a word with you, Severus said, and he looked as though saying those particular words left a rather foul taste in his mouth. It somehow made Tom feel much better to know that Severus apparently felt rather out of his depth as well in this new-to-them setting. Remus told me about the conversation you two had some time ago about your worries that you have trouble with social situations and perhaps people in general. Tom gave a very slow nod. He still didn't touch his cup of tea. Severus inhaled a deep breath, gaze fixed on something beyond Tom's shoulder. I went looking for answers, and since mental health in the wizarding world is still stuck somewhere in the Middle Ages, I searched the Muggle world for suggestions. Severus opened a drawer in his desk and produced a small Muggle book. He placed it in front of Tom. It had a white cover with large black letters that said, "So you think you're autistic?" I do not think I am autistic, Tom said at once with a huge scowl on his face. Severus, I'm not retarded, I assure you. 10 points from Slytherin for using a slur, Severus said at once, and then narrowed his eyes. I want you to read the book. Why? Tom asked, crossing his arms and leaning back in his chair. I've seen a movie once about a very strange man who was autistic. I'm nothing like that. Just read the fucking book, Severus snarled, sounding much more like himself again. You read 20 books a week. One more isn't going to kill you. Fine. Tom snatched up the stupid book and shoved it into his book bag. See me tomorrow morning for a discussion. Severus rose from his chair, and Tom quickly did the same. Neither one of them had touched their cups of tea. Why did you even bother with tea? Tom couldn't help but ask. Remus made me promise, Severus said with a faint sneer. He insisted you'd need it for this conversation. Remus and his promises, Tom said with an amused chuckle. Just for the record, I much prefer brewing whenever we talk. Severus nodded. Duly noted. Now get out. Tom resisted opening the book for 2 whole hours, but eventually his curiosity got the better of him. That and his desire to prove Severus wrong. Tom was not a goddamn retard, he was sure of it. So, armed with quill and paper, Tom found the most comfortable seat in the library and read the book, taking notes whenever he spotted something that definitely didn't apply to him. The scroll remained woefully empty as Tom read page after page of information that started sounding more and more familiar the further in the book he got. Sensory overload was definitely something Tom could relate to. He remembered how the screaming of younger children used to drive him nearly insane, how it made him scream at people to just shut up already, and how whatever foster parent he was living with at that moment punished him for having a temper tantrum. Even to this day, Tom didn't like loud noises. It was one of the reasons he never attended Quidditch games, other than that Tom didn't care for sports of any kind. All those people screaming around him drove him mad. There was also the need for routine that Tom recognized in himself, and the difficulty reading other people, and being a bit more egocentric than the average person, and the ability to hyper-focus on whatever interested him, and his need for alone time away from people, even the people he actually liked. Holy fuck, Tom was autistic. That realization came just as he started reading the final chapter. Severus had been right after all. It did explain a lot. No, it explained everything. The moment Tom finished the book, he read it again, but this time with the understanding that it actually applied to him, and by the time he finished it for a second time, his mind was reeling. The next morning, Tom met Severus in his classroom where several cauldrons stood waiting to be used. Tom released a relieved breath at just the sight of it. This was just as it should be. Start on a blood replenishing potion, then brew some fever reducer, Severus said, without even looking at him. And Tom got started at once, happy to be brewing with his guardian again. So I'm autistic, Tom said conversationally after he was done with his first batch. So am I, Severus said without even looking up. I read the book before giving it to you. It explains everything, Tom said, unable to keep a certain level of awe out of his voice at finally having found answers about himself. That it does, Severus agreed quietly. I'll pick up some more books this weekend. That would be great. And that was all they said on the subject. They brewed and enjoyed each other's quiet company, and as far as Tom was concerned, it had been a very pleasant and productive morning. After lunch, Remus had tea waiting for him in his office. I'm autistic, Tom told him, and Remus answered with a smile and a hug. I'm so proud of you, Remus mumbled against Tom's shoulder. When he pulled back, he added, If you need anything, let me know. Tom shrugged as he sat down and reached for his tea. Severus is getting us more books. Oh, there might be one thing. Tom gave Remus a hopeful look. Are you familiar with a spell that dampens sound and that isn't the bubblehead charm? Remus got an eager glint in his eyes. Alas, no. But let's finish our tea and go look for one in the library. By the time dinner rolled around and students started returning, Tom had found a charm that he could apply to himself as needed and that brought down the decibels around him significantly. He could still hear people talking, but everything was wonderfully muted. For the first time, Tom didn't mind sitting at the Slytherin table as the students around him returned and produced ungodly amounts of noise. Now that Tom had a better understanding of himself and his own mind, he knew it was time to seriously start working on the Harriet problem. Tom had some ideas of how to show her support. The first thing he did during January's Hogsmeade weekend was get his hands on one of those pamphlets Harriet and her friends were handing out in Hogsmeade again. He charmed her fourth-year Ravenclaw to hand it over, and the stuttering girl did so without much prompting. The pamphlet was about rights for trans men and trans women, unsurprisingly, and it urged the recipients to write to the ministry to demand new laws. Ah, those poor, naive Gryffindors. The ministry was the wrong place to send letters to. Politicians didn't care about these kind of subjects. The only thing they cared about was power and how to keep it. As long as the public voice demanding change wasn't loud enough, the politicians would happily ignore it. Well, Tom was absolutely positive he could run a better public campaign for trans rights than those naive Gryffindors, and that is exactly what he did. Tom created a petition and then went around Hogwarts charming, convincing, cajoling, and occasionally cursing students into signing it. After a few weeks, Tom had gotten the majority of the student population to sign, even most of the Slytherins, hence the aforementioned cursing part. He had only skipped the Gryffindor since most of those still glared at him as though he'd personally murdered their mothers. Severus did find a few more helpful books on autism and neurodivergence in general, and they both devoured them in days. Tom regularly applied the muting charm, and his life at Hogwarts improved with leaps and bounds, much more even than he'd expected. All the noises around him had been bothering him much more than he'd previously realized. Just as February's Hogsmeade weekend drew near, Tom was ready to start his open support of Harriet. The first thing he did was approach Remus. "Do you have a Gryffindor scarf I can borrow?" Tom asked during one of their regular meetings in Remus's office. "I'm sure I can find one for you to use, certainly," Remus said with an amused little smile. "Does this have anything to do with the Gryffindor Ravenclaw match this upcoming Saturday?" Tom shrugged and smiled and refused to confirm or deny anything. It had everything to do with that Quidditch match, though, and come Saturday, Tom applied the muting charm, wound Remus's Gryffindor scarf around his neck, and sat down in the Gryffindor section of the Quidditch stands, well away from Harriet's friends, because he had no desire to get cursed in the back. Harriet, once she spotted him in the crowd, almost flew against the Ravenclaw chaser in shock, but quickly recovered, though she did sway for a few moments more as she regained her composure. Tom ignored anything and everything around him except the sight of Harriet on her broom. And even though Tom didn't care one bit for Quidditch, he had to admit that Harriet Potter was born to fly. She became one with her broom as she increased her speed in pursuit of the snitch. And when she caught it, almost 2 hours into the game, Tom jumped to his feet and cheered just as hard as all the Gryffindors around him. As he was leaving the Quidditch pitch, Tom ran into Mr. and Mrs. Potter. James was chatting happily with Remus, and Lily turned around when she spotted Tom approaching them. "What a lovely scarf," Lily said with a knowing smile. Tom wound the scarf a little tighter around his neck, looking as though he didn't have a care in the world. "Oh, just here to support someone who's very important to me." "I'm sure Harriet appreciates that," Lily said, not even bothering to pretend she didn't understand what exactly was going on here. "She's thinking of playing professionally for at least a few years out of Hogwarts. Well, that is, if the Quidditch League ever gets their heads out of their arses and stops excluding trans people from official matches." Tom frowned and shared a knowing look with Lily. "They're utter morons if they reject Harriet solely for that. She's one of the best players this school has seen in ages, I'm sure." Just then a garbled, disbelieving noise sounded behind them, and when Tom looked over his shoulder, he saw Harriet standing there, disheveled, sweaty, and with both broom and snitch in hand. "You were amazing," Tom said, as sincerely as he could. "You were meant to play Quidditch. I understand that now." And with that, Tom nodded at Lily and left. As he passed Remus, James gave Tom a thumbs up and a wink, and Tom studiously ignored him. He'd love to interact with Harriet more, of course he would, but he wasn't quite ready for that yet. He still had a few other things to accomplish first. Like teach Slytherin House a new, very important lesson. "What the fuck?" Draco yelled as Tom stepped into the castle, Gryffindor scarf still wound around his neck. "What the actual fuck, Tom?" Draco was standing in the middle of the entrance hall as though he'd been waiting for Tom. Their classmates and half of Slytherin House gathered around him. Further back, Tom noticed Longbottom and the Weasley girl lingering, as though eager to see a confrontation play about between Tom and Draco. Merlin's balls, Tom sighed in utter exasperation. I finally attend the Quidditch match like you've all been whining about for years, and I get yelled at for my troubles. Theo ducked his head to hide his smirk, but Blaise had no such shame and openly laughed at Draco's look of utter disbelief. Tom, you cannot be serious, Drella said with a heartbroken moan. Potter is practically a mudblood. She is far... Drella ended her brief monologue with a pained shriek after Tom cursed her. Nothing serious, just a skin-crawling hags, but that should get the message across just fine. 10 points from Slytherin, he said, just to drive the knife in a little further. That word is a slur, and from now on I will not have any of you use it ever again. Is that understood? Most of the younger years nodded at once, still remembering Tom's talent for obscure curses from the last time he had taught them all a lesson. Most of the older years looked ready to argue, and if that didn't work, to duel Tom into the ground. Tom didn't mind. He knew he would win. There was no one in Slytherin House who could beat him in sheer power, and Tom had a mind like a sponge. He'd forgotten more hexes and curses by now than all the other students had ever managed to master. So Tom wasn't worried, and though he gave Madame Pomfrey quite a bit more work over the following week, eventually the lesson was learned, and not a single Slytherin uttered that word around Tom ever again. The next phase of his plan required Tom to write 2 letters. One an introduction to the petition he'd put together, and the other one an op-ed piece about his own opinions concerning trans rights. The letter concerning the petition was simple and to the point. To whom it may concern, hereby we, the students of Hogwarts, offer up our signatures in the support of the same rights for trans men and trans women as the rest of us wizards and witches enjoy. Trans men are men, and trans women are women, and as such no distinction should be made for them in the law or in any other endeavor in life. We are the future of this magical nation, and we support a progressive nation, not one who discriminates against its own citizens. Signed, the students of Hogwarts. Tom sent that off with a copy of all the signatures to the Daily Prophet. He followed that up the next day with a short opinion piece. Lucky to be me. I was born a man. I've never had to work extra hard because my gender held me back. I've never had people not take me seriously because what happens to sit between my legs. I've never had to look over my shoulder because someone might try to assault me because they believe I'm easy prey. I was lucky to be born this way. I was born white. I've never had to listen to people make ignorant comments about my race. I've never had to work extra hard because the color of my skin makes people hesitant and give me the same opportunities as others get. I've never had to put up with people convinced they're superior to me just because their skin is a different color than mine. I was lucky to be born this way. I was born straight. I've never had to listen to my sexuality be used as a slur. I've never had to put up with family pressuring me to marry someone I'm not sexually attracted to. I've never had to fear my family rejecting me for something I cannot change about myself. I was lucky to be born this way. I was born in a body that matches my gender. I've never had to plead with others to believe me when I tell them who I really am. I've never had to fear parents rejecting me because they believe me to be someone I'm not. I've never had to listen to friends get angry with me because they don't understand who I really am. I was lucky to be born this way. I'm male, cisgender, straight, and white, but some of the people I care most about in the world are not. That is why I fight for equal rights, because they deserve them as much as I do, because they are people like you and me. A different color or a different gender, but they are living, breathing, feeling individuals who matter as much as anyone. Only by giving them our support and solidarity can we change a world for the better for everyone. Tom Marvolo Riddle, Slytherin 5th year prefect. Tom wasn't sure about it at first, worried it might be too heavy-handed. But when he let Remus read it, the man proclaimed it amazing and gave Tom another hug. He'd been doing that a lot lately, but according to Remus, it was because Tom had done a lot of good things over the past few weeks that made Remus very proud of him. Anyway, Tom sent that letter to the prophet as well, and then he sat back and waited. He didn't have to wait very long. On Friday, the Daily Prophet was dedicated almost entirely to the struggle that's tearing the wizarding world apart. Guess who wrote that article? But aside from the overly dramatic main article, they had printed Tom's petition and every single signature, and Tom's opinion piece. Draco was making all sorts of disbelieving noises while reading the paper, while Druella all but burst into tears when she finally realized Tom was never going to give her the light of day. Pansy patted her on the back and offered her many handkerchiefs to stem the tears that Druella couldn't hold back in the end. Tom had forgone the muted charm that morning, just so he could hear what would happen at the Gryffindor table. Harriet and her friends were apparently very confused about the petition for a few moments, until the Weasley girl realized she could just ask a random Hufflepuff who had been going around Hogwarts with the petition. Once they realized it was Tom, the entirety of Gryffindor House stared at him with wide eyes, mouths hanging open, as though Tom had just publicly proclaimed to be the reincarnation of Godric Gryffindor. "It's a trap," Weasley said at once, while Longbottom opened and closed his mouth multiple times, unable to find any suitable words to say. "It has to be a trap," Weasley repeated quite a few more times. "He's love-bombing you," Granger told Harriet urgently. "I'm quite sure this is some sort of red flag." Harriet didn't seem to hear any of her classmates as she stared at Tom in utter confusion. How Tom wanted to explain himself to her now, give her all the reasons why he'd acted like he had. But Harriet was still avoiding him, and Tom was out of ideas on how to approach her. Wait a second. James had the answer to that all along. Go big or go home. Without even realizing what he was doing, Tom stood up and without hesitation stepped up onto the bench and then the table, kicking several breakfast dishes aside as he stood up straight and spread his arm. "Harriet Potter!" "What the fuck?" Draco muttered, looking between all the ruined dishes. "I wanted to eat those sausages, fuckwit." "Harriet Potter, I am a half-wit," Tom yelled, his heart swelling with so many emotions it somehow made his head spin. "I am a simpleton. I am a moron. I am a dumbass. But most importantly, I am a penitent man." At the head table, Severus made to stand up, but Remus quickly yanked on his sleeve and pulled him back down, an enormous grin on his face. Surprisingly, McGonagall did the exact same thing when Dumbledore got up to put a stop to whatever the hell Tom was doing. "I am so sorry for the way I treated you," Tom continued, voice ringing around the great hall while every student looked at him with wide eyes, unsure what was even happening and wondering if perhaps perfect prefect Tom was finally having a nervous breakdown of sorts after consistently reading 20 books a week on top of everything else he accomplished on a given day. "I was an ignorant fool who ruined my chances with the most perfect girl in all the world." There was a soft "ah" that rose up from quite a few girls around the hall. Most of the male students laughed uncomfortably at such a public display of emotions. Draco was still whining about his sausages while Pansy had to take Druella to the infirmary for a calming draught. "I beg you to forgive me so that I can spend the rest of my life proving to you that I am a changed man." It was at this point that the rush of adrenaline that had washed over Tom started to recede, and he suddenly realized where he was and what he was doing. His head became suspiciously light, and his heart hammered in his chest, and Tom realized he needed to sit down for a moment before he had a complete meltdown. Just as Tom jumped off the table, Granger said much too loudly, "Oh yes, he is definitely love-bombing you, Harriet. Don't fall for it." Tom rushed out of the great hall, but naturally he wasn't alone. Harriet jumped up from the Gryffindor table. "Tom, wait!" On her heels were Granger, all Weasleys, Longbottom, and pretty much every other Gryffindor. The Slytherins weren't about to miss this spectacle, and neither were the Ravenclaws and Hufflepuffs. So basically, the great hall emptied and everyone gathered in the entrance hall. "Then why did you never show me any support before?" Harriet said as she caught up with a bewildered Tom. "I'm not sure what you mean," Tom said, ignoring the many students around them and focusing solely on Harriet. Her hair was wild and her cheeks were flushed and her green eyes bright. Tom wanted to kiss her so badly he'd happily give up a year of his life to do so. "I mean, before you lost your goddamn mind," Harriet said with fire in her voice, fists on her hips as she gave Tom a challenging glare. "I didn't know until Draco started crowing about it," Tom said, unsure why Harriet would think otherwise. "What?" Harriet relaxed her arms while she exchanged a few uncertain looks with her friends. "But I thought Remus had told you ages ago." Tom shook his head. "Ask him if you don't believe me." "Oh, fuck," Harriet breathed, now looking at Tom with a very different expression. "I thought you knew all along." "Nope." "Harriet," Granger said urgently, placing a firm hand on Harriet's shoulder. "Remember, he's still a narcissist who only cares for himself. He's love-bombing you. Red flag." "Excuse me," Tom said, more than a little tempted to hex the stuffing out of Granger. "I happen to be autistic, and there's nothing wrong with that." He hadn't meant to say that in front of pretty much the entire school, but he was damned if he was going to have Hermione Granger use some ridiculous armchair psychiatry on him, proclaiming him to be something he was not. "What?" Granger said in utter surprise, even taking a step back. "Are you serious?" "Well, self-diagnosed for now, but yes, I am completely certain," Tom said, glancing at Harriet to see how she was taking this news. Surprisingly, she was beaming at him. "Self-diagnosis is completely valid," Granger said, taking a few steps closer to Tom. "I'm self-diagnosed, autism and ADHD. I figured it out when I was 8 and my parents took me to see a doctor, but this was the NHS and they had no clue about neurodiversity, so the doctor claimed I couldn't be autistic because I made eye contact, and I couldn't have ADHD because only boys got that. That doctor was obviously completely wrong." Tom blinked at the tirade of words and suddenly an idea popped into his head. It was something he had considered a few times before in a vague sort of way. But this was the perfect opportunity because Tom understood all too well that to win Harriet over, he needed to win her friends over as well. Tom swallowed and said, "I was thinking of starting a student group for autism and ADHD, for support." Granger bounced up and down on the balls of her feet, hands dancing through the air. "Yes! That is what Hogwarts needs. I tried to start one of those in first year, but McGonagall refused to sponsor it, and she didn't believe there was a need for it." "I know a professor who will most certainly sponsor this student group," Tom said with a secretive little smile. "Remus?" Harriet gasped, looking between Granger and Tom as though all her dreams had just come true. "Well, he would sponsor it too," Tom said with a chuckle, knowing Remus would do almost anything for Harriet or Tom. "But I have somebody else in mind." "I'd like to sign up." That was said by a 7th-year Ravenclaw. Tom believed he was called Richie Wilkes. "Officially diagnosed and medicated." "Oh," Granger said, immediately rounding up on the poor student. "How did your diagnosis go? Please tell me everything." Tom wanted desperately to ask the Ravenclaw about what sort of medication he was using and what the effects of it were, but he understood now was not the time. But once their support group was up and running, it would be one of the first subjects on the agenda. "Yes," Harriet said, looking up at Tom with glowing cheeks and a soft smile. "What?" "Yes, I'll go to Hogsmeade with you." Suddenly, Harriet's expression fell and she chewed her lip. "If you still want to, that is." "Yes, of course, this weekend, and you can decide what we'll do," Tom said, all of that as quickly as he could in one single breath, and when Harriet started smiling at him again, Tom got the ridiculous impulse to jump up and shout in happiness. He ignored those silly impulses and instead gave Harriet a sincere smile in return. "I can't wait." "Me neither," Harriet agreed in a whisper. They did make it to Hogsmeade that weekend, and Harriet did get to decide where they went. A Quidditch shop, the 3 broomsticks, a second-hand bookstore for Tom, and finally a relaxing walk to the Shrieking Shack, where Tom gathered every bit of courage and kissed Harriet. It was short and sweet, and the beginning of many wonderful things to come. The end. And that was the end of this story. Thank you so much for listening. I will be uploading more stories that I have written, one-shots, but also more of my chaptered stories. Again, thanks for listening, and hopefully I will see you again soon. Goodbye.